something that really bothers me, and this has been mentioned on the debates, and that is the idea of undermining the principle of habeas corpus. Been around since the 13th century. It's been something that we have honored, and quite frankly, we cannot remain and live in a free country if you don't have high regards and respect for habeas corpus. Otherwise, people can just disappear and never heard about it because they never have their day in court. It hasn't happened to a lot of people. It's happened to a few. Of course, they're always the bad guys. They're always the ones who are the terrorists. Of course, they've never had a trial, they've never been convicted, but they're not entitled to a hearing. So that principle is very, very important. So it's something that we have to be aware of and make sure that that can be reversed. Another thing that happened, Another thing that was stuck on the DOD budget last year had to do with the essential repeal of the Insurrection Act of 1807. In 1807, they made it explicitly clear that the president could declare an emergency and there could be some calling up of troops domestically under very, very strict conditions. And the governors had to give permission and the Congress had to be participating. The rules have been changed, and also alters the strengthening of the Insurrection Act, of the Posse Comitatus Act after the Civil War. But now, that essentially has been all repealed. A president now can declare martial law and an emergency without congressional approval. He can call up a National Guard, use them for a year without the consent of the governor, and he can take an Air National Guard or an Army Guard unit and move it into another state without their permission. Why in the world would they put that authority on, give it to a president if someday they didn't think they might use it? Well, I'll tell you one thing. If I'm ever in that seat, I would never use it and never abuse it. In a state of war, our liberties are continually threatened. They're threatened in many ways. Our civil liberties are undermined, but they're undermined in other ways as well. And that is financially. All great nations who believed that they could run the world and run their empire have failed. They failed for various reasons. They've become fat and lazy, and they live off stolen money, or in this day and age, they live off printed money, which is equivalent to stealing money. Empires end badly because countries go bankrupt. And essentially, that's what happened to the Soviet system. They collapsed on themselves. It wasn't because we had more weapons than they had. It was because they overextended themselves. Especially the climactic blow was when they went into Afghanistan. And ironically, where are we today? In Afghanistan. And where's the money going to come from? This week, another grand entitlement program was passed in Washington. More of free medical care for everybody that's poor. Well, that's great. It's great to have concern and compassion. But where are they going to get the money? What if it doesn't work? And it gets more pressure on the financial system. So when this climax to this comes, we're going to have a financial crisis that's going to be designed through the dollar crisis. And quite frankly, I think the beginning has started right now. The government tells us there's a 2% inflation rate. Does anybody believe that our prices are going up at a rate of 2%? And there's not a good reason to accept those figures, and therefore the people become disgruntled. They're disgruntled with their war. They're disgruntled with being lied about the economy. The economy is always grand, low unemployment, and no concern. That what they don't realize or what they won't admit is, yes, on the surface, we have a lot of prosperity. But there's a lot of borrowing, a lot of debt, and we can't even fight a war over in Iraq or the Middle East without borrowing money from our banker. Tragically, our banker today is China. That has to end. Eventually this will end, though, and we'll have to slow up the spending. There's no reason and an ability for us to continue to do that. But you know, this didn't happen overnight. We didn't lose our liberties with this administration. It wasn't just two administrations. We know the last administration just had the same foreign policy. But this foreign policy and our domestic policy has been going on for a good many years. And in many ways, I believe our foreign policy took a major step in the wrong direction in 1916, 1917, where the president had been elected to keep us out of a foreign war. I would say that our culprit in this case, and that we're still suffering from, is the grandiose schemes of Woodrow Wilson. Go in there and the pressure to go into World War I was absolutely unnecessary. It led to a Versailles Treaty, which was a disastrous. It was during that treaty that they designed the borders that are all artificial in the Middle East, and we're still fighting over those borders. So it makes no sense at all for us to have this policy of intervention, which is also, you know, the problems just continue on and on. But not only did the foreign policy misled in those years in the teens, but we had a few other disastrous things happen in 1913. One was an amendment, and that had to do with the way we elect our senators. A lot of people understand that, and it should be corrected, but not many people talk about it. But they do know about that other amendment in the 16th Amendment, 1913, that we want to get rid of as soon as possible. First question I'm usually asked from the media when I bring that subject up, or they bring it up, what are you going to replace it with? I'm going to replace it with nothing. And how are you going to pay the bills? Not the spending. That's what you have to do. Yes, sir. None of these problems can be solved if we continue as a country to endorse the philosophy of welfarism and socialism and entitlements and interventions, foreign policy, and a world empire. Can't do it. We're going to go broke. There's no reason why we can't have a transition. There's no reason why we can't go from where we are logically and cautiously to a more sensible approach. If we continue on this course, we will have a financial crisis. And we will have a destruction of the dollar. That is very, very dangerous economically, very, very dangerous politically. But there's a simple way to do this. Simple mathematically, simple in terms of explaining it, but difficult politically. Because all we have to do is start talking about cutting the spending overseas. It's not $100 billion or $200 billion or $300 billion. If you add up everything that we do overseas, we're essentially spending close to $1 trillion a year. But if you change the policy, you can save $300, $400, $500 billion. You can bring our troops home from Korea and Europe and the Middle East. We would have a stronger national economy. With that money you would save about hundreds of billions of dollars. You could literally cut down on the deficit, cut back, and literally be able to tide the people over, the generations of people now that are dependent on government. You can't just purposely turn a switch. Of course, if you let the crisis come, the switch will be turned and they will be without care. But there's no reason why they can't be taken care of. They do not have to be put out in the streets. We can actually do better. Today, the incentive in Washington, as the spending goes up on the war, they start to nickel and dime things at home, and they even cut back on some of the veterans' benefits. That's obscene. But the policy, if we can change our policy, we can do it. But we cannot do it if we don't change our attitude about what the role of government ought to be. Now, I'm not inventing what I think is the best role for government. I am just repeating what we had, what America's all about. I'm repeating what's in the Constitution.